When the HOA president tried to push him out, she never imagined she was stepping into her own worst nightmare. Jaxon Carter had spent years grinding to afford his dream home, a beautiful, two-story colonial in Oak Ridge Heights, Virginia. It was the kind of neighborhood where manicured lawns stretched for blocks, where every house had a porch swing and a white picket fence. A place that screamed stability, success, and the quiet life he had always wanted. The moment he stepped onto his new property, a deep sense of satisfaction washed over him. He had made it, but something felt wrong. Even as he unloaded boxes from the moving truck, Jaxon couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Curtains fluttered as eyes disappeared behind them. Neighbors paused mid-stride while walking their golden retrievers, lingering just a second too long before turning away. There were no warm greetings, no handshakes, no welcome baskets, just an eerie, heavy silence that clung to the air like fog before a storm. At first, Jaxon dismissed it. Maybe the neighbors just valued their privacy. Maybe, in time, they'd come around. The first sign that wouldn't happen came the very next morning. He had barely taken his first sip of coffee when a sharp knock echoed through the house. Jaxon opened the door to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was impeccably dressed, beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a navy cardigan with a gold HOA emblem pinned neatly to the lapel. Her back was straight, her expression composed, but her eyes. There was something unsettling in them, something Jaxon couldn't quite read. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped and formal. "I'm Eleanor Hastings, president of the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association." Jaxon extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. I know who you are," she cut in, her gaze flickering past him, scanning the inside of his home like she was taking inventory. "I wanted to go over a few things." She thrust a thick packet of stapled documents into his hands. HOA guidelines. Jaxon flipped through them. Lawn maintenance requirements, exterior paint restrictions, an entire section on mailbox specifications. Seemed like standard HOA red tape. Then Eleanor cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze shifting to the moving truck still idling in the driveway. "I assume that will be gone by this evening." Jaxon raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone when I'm done unpacking." Eleanor nodded, but it wasn't the kind of nod that signaled approval, more like she was filing the response away for later. "Good," she said crisply. "And just so you're aware, the HOA has strict guidelines regarding waste disposal. Trash bins should not be placed at the curb before 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Jaxon frowned. "I didn't put them out." "Must have been the previous owners." Eleanor pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away. Jaxon shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just particular. A lot of HOA presidents were. He wasn't about to let one overly involved neighbor ruin his fresh start. But over the next few days, it became painfully clear Eleanor wasn't just particular, she was watching. A warning notice appeared in his mailbox about an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, his own car. A second notice followed, citing improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe two. Then came an official HOA violation letter about his porch light being excessively bright, despite it being the exact same fixture the previous owner had installed. By the end of the week, Jaxon had accumulated a neat little stack of paperwork from Eleanor Hastings. He hadn't seen or spoken to her since their first meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made her presence known. Still, he kept his cool. Maybe she was just. Maybe if he followed the rules, she'd back off. But that hope didn't last long. One evening, Jaxon decided to take a walk. As he strolled past a group of neighbors gathered in a driveway, their conversation fell silent. A woman in a pastel sweater forced a tight smile, but no one else acknowledged him. Their gazes lingered just long enough to make it clear he wasn't welcome. And there, standing in the middle, arms crossed, was Eleanor Hastings. She leaned in, whispering something to the others, her eyes never leaving Jaxon. He didn't need to hear the words. This wasn't about HOA rules, this was about him. But if Eleanor thought she could pressure him into leaving, she was in for a rude awakening. The letters kept coming. Every morning, another notice appeared in his mailbox, sealed with the Oak Ridge Heights HOA emblem. At first, Jaxon barely glanced at them, stuffing them into a kitchen drawer. He already knew what they would say. Eleanor Hastings was determined to make his life miserable. By the time the fifth letter arrived in just 2 weeks, he had had enough. This one was about his trash cans. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter read. Jaxon stared at the paper, irritation simmering beneath the surface. He had picked up his bins just like everyone else after work. But apparently that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to run a little experiment. The next morning, he woke up early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood, keeping his eyes on the curbs. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still out, some overflowing, lids half open. Not a single violation notice in sight, just his. Jaxon snapped a few photos and drafted a polite email to the HOA board, questioning why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were ignored. No response, but 2 days later, Eleanor was back on his doorstep. She didn't knock this time. She just stood there, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, waiting. Jaxon sighed and opened the door, leaning casually against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze drifted past him, scanning the interior of his home like she was cataloging every detail. Then, without preamble, she held up a form. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of homeownership," she said, her tone smooth but firm. "We've had complaints." Jaxon felt his stomach tighten. "Complaints?" "Neighbors have expressed concerns," Eleanor continued, her voice laced with artificial sweetness. "They've noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations." Jaxon let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're kidding." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. "First of all, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving, and that's why there have been deliveries. And as for the cars, those are friends and family. You know, people visit." Eleanor's grip on her clipboard tightened ever so slightly. "Well," she said coolly, "we have policies in place to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Jaxon knew exactly what this was. She hadn't asked any other neighbors for proof of homeownership. Just him. Still, he kept his voice even. "You can pull the records yourself. It's public information." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, just for a fraction of a second. But she recovered quickly, smoothing her expression into one of polite indifference. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." Jaxon tilted his head. "And if I don't?" Eleanor's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board." Jaxon exhaled slowly, biting back the words sitting on the edge of his tongue. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to give her the perfect excuse to turn him into the problem. So he just smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, then closed the door before she could say another word. Eleanor didn't like that. That evening, as Jaxon sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer, he saw her again. She stood at the end of his driveway, deep in conversation with a man in a crisp polo and khakis. Every so often, she gestured toward Jaxon's house, her voice hushed, her expression tight. The man nodded, jotting something down in a notepad. Jaxon didn't have to guess what was happening. Eleanor wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was looking for a way to get rid of him. But if she thought she could push him out, she was about to learn a hard lesson. The next morning, Jaxon woke up to an email from the HOA. Subject, notice of violation. It was about his porch furniture. According to the email, his outdoor seating arrangement to wicker chairs and a small glass table failed to meet the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA guidelines. A vague rule, one that, conveniently, wasn't being enforced on anyone else. Jaxon leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had walked this neighborhood more than enough times to know at least a dozen homes had similar setups. Some even had faded plastic chairs that looked like they'd been there since the early 2000s. And yet, somehow, his was the problem. He ignored the notice. A day later, another email arrived. Subject: second notice, lawn maintenance violation. Jaxon frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, edged, and watered. He had spent an entire afternoon trimming the hedges, making sure everything was spotless. But there it was, a formal complaint stating that his grass was slightly overgrown and warning that fines could be issued if the problem wasn't corrected. Jaxon knew exactly what was happening. Eleanor was trying to drown him in complaints, stacking up minor infractions until she had enough leverage to escalate things. Fine, if she wanted to play games, he'd play, too. That evening, he took a slow walk through the neighborhood, noting every actual violation. He saw overgrown lawns, chipped paint, broken shutters, house numbers so faded they were barely readable, trash bins still sitting by the curb from the morning before. Then he submitted his own complaints, each one backed with time-stamped photos. It took less than 24 hours for Eleanor to show up again. This time, she wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of Jaxon's driveway with another HOA board member, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard tucked under his arm. Jaxon recognized him from the HOA website. Stephen Reynolds, vice president. Eleanor's expression was tighter than usual, her forced politeness barely concealing her irritation. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice stretched thin. "We received your list of complaints." Jaxon crossed his arms, nodding. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Stephen cleared his throat, exchanging a glance with Eleanor before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns," he said, measured and diplomatic, "but the HOA board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice." Jaxon scoffed. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't." Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her folder, pulled out a printed form, and held it out to him. "This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture needs to be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Jaxon stared at the paper, then slowly looked up at Eleanor. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't about grass or furniture. This was about control, about making him feel like he didn't belong. He took a deep breath, forcing a slow, deliberate smile. "You know, Eleanor, I've read the HOA bylaws from top to bottom," he said, his voice steady. "Nowhere does it say a homeowner needs to replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Eleanor stiffened. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Jaxon raised an eyebrow. "So you enforce rules that don't exist?" Eleanor's jaw twitched. Stephen shifted uncomfortably for the first time. Jaxon caught at that flicker of doubt in the board member's expression. He wasn't fully convinced. Jaxon decided to push a little further. "Let me ask you something," he said, his tone measured. "If I were someone else, say, one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Eleanor's nostrils flared. Stephen opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. "No answer." Jaxon nodded, folding the paper in half. "That's what I thought." Eleanor inhaled sharply, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Jaxon held her gaze, unwavering. "Then do what you have to do." Eleanor turned on her heel and walked away, her posture rigid with barely contained frustration. Stephen lingered for a second, avoiding eye contact, then followed. Jaxon watched them go, gripping the violation notice in his hand. He had just called her bluff, but Eleanor Hastings wasn't the type to back down easily. Jaxon expected retaliation. What he didn't expect was how far she'd take it. The next morning, a thick envelope sat in Jaxon's mailbox. No HOA logo this time. Instead, the sender was a law firm. Inside was an official complaint filed with the Fairfax County Housing Authority accusing him of fraudulent occupancy. Eleanor had escalated from petty fines to trying to have him legally removed from his own home. Jaxon stared at the document, his pulse steady, but his fingers tightened around the paper. She was really doing this. He skimmed through the complaint. The claims were weak allegations that he had failed to provide proof of ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a vague statement claiming multiple neighbors had raised concerns about his presence. No names, no actual proof, just assumptions dressed up in legal jargon. For a second, Jaxon considered tossing it in the trash. The accusations wouldn't hold up. But then it hit him this wasn't about getting him evicted. This was about exhausting him. Eleanor wanted to bury him in legal headaches, drain him of time and energy, push him to the point where walking away seemed easier than fighting back. What she didn't know was that she was playing right into his hands. That evening, Jaxon picked up his phone and dialed. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line picked up, "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had been Jackson's real estate attorney for years, sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Eleanor ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Jaxon had everything he needed. And he wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to end this. The HOA meeting was packed. Eleanor stood at the front, clearing her throat before lifting a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Carter's residence. Given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members, I'd like to speak," Jaxon interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Eleanor's lips thinned. "You'll have a chance to respond after." "No," Jaxon said, setting down a stack of his own documents. "I'm speaking now." A murmur spread through the room. Eleanor stiffened but, after a moment, gave a tight nod. "Fine." Jaxon reached for the first document in his stack and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "is the deed for 314 Hawthorne Lane." Eleanor's house. Silence crashed over the room. Jaxon didn't sit back down. He let the weight of the moment settle, let Eleanor process what had just happened. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to have him removed had just found out that her own house belonged to him. And she hadn't even known. Eleanor's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. Then, in a quiet, strained voice, she asked how Jaxon felt it. The power she had wielded over him for weeks had just evaporated in front of everyone. And he wasn't done. He reached for another document from his neatly stacked pile. "Now," he said, flipping it open, "let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts." Eleanor's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Jaxon tapped the legal complaint. "You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my own home." He paused, locking eyes with her. "Would you care to explain?" The room shifted. This wasn't just between Jaxon and Eleanor anymore. The entire room was watching neighbors, HOA members, homeowners who had blindly trusted her leadership. Eleanor opened her mouth, but Jaxon didn't give her the chance to recover. "You accused me of violating HOA policies," he said, his voice level, controlled. "Yet, you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community." He pulled out a stack of printed emails. "I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days." He looked at the board, his expression unreadable. None of them resulted in violation notices. Then, he turned to the rest of the board. "Tell me why is that?" Silence, uneasy shifting. A few exchanged glances. People were starting to see it. What had been happening right in front of them all along? Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "Mr. Carter, I was simply trying to intimidate me into leaving." Jaxon cut in smoothly. "Yeah, I got that." Silence. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through. "This is a disgrace." Jaxon turned. Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of Oak Ridge Heights, shook his head, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You really tried to evict the man who owns your house." A few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd. Another board member frowned. "Eleanor, is this true?" Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came out. She had buried herself. Jaxon leaned back in his chair, voice calm, deliberate. "I suggest you start paying up." He let the words settle, then added, "Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you?" A low chuckle swept through the crowd. Even some of the board members were barely containing their reactions. Eleanor's face burned red. For weeks, she had tried to control Jaxon, to wear him down, to push him out. And now, in front of the entire HOA, her authority had been reduced to nothing. Her jaw tightened. Then, without another word, she stood, turned on her heel, and walked out. The silence she left behind was thick. No one moved, no one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as if only now realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. Jaxon didn't move either. He didn't have to. He had already won. Jaxon just sat back, watching. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. "Can you believe this?" someone whispered. "She tried to evict the wrong guy," another chuckled. At the table, Stephen Reynolds awkwardly cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Well," he started hesitantly, "I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled. That was one way to put it." And yet until Eleanor had embarrassed herself, no one had said a word. The guilt was settling in now, but guilt wasn't an apology. And Jaxon wasn't interested in empty words. Instead, he turned to Stephen. "Since we're all still here, let's talk about actual HOA violations." Stephen straightened in his chair, uneasy. "Like what?" Jaxon picked up his list, the same one Eleanor had ignored for weeks. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. He let his eyes sweep across the board. "These aren't one-time issues. They exist right now." Then he turned to the rest of the board. "So tell me, are we finally going to start enforcing the rules fairly?" Lisa, another board member, shifted uncomfortably. "Do we even have the authority to do that?" Stephen let out a slow breath. "The board can vote for removal if an HOA officer is found abusing their position." Jaxon leaned forward. "Then put it to a vote." A heavy pause. Then Lisa nodded, seconded. One by one, hands rose around the room. Jaxon watched as the same people who had stood by silently now voted to strip Eleanor Hastings of her title. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she'd still be HOA president, but her own obsession had destroyed her. The meeting adjourned, and people trickled out. But the person who needed to hear it most was still in denial. Because Eleanor Hastings wasn't done yet. Eleanor Hastings didn't take defeat lightly, and so the tides had turned. For weeks, Eleanor had wielded her authority like a weapon, convinced she was untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't Jaxon who had destroyed her standing, it was her own arrogance, her own miscalculation. She had spent so much time trying to force him out, she never saw the real danger creeping in. Herself, now, the neighborhood was shifting. The HOA finally served its purpose, not as a tool for control, but as a system for real change. And the people. Some still averted their eyes when they passed Jaxon, the weight of their complicity heavy on their shoulders. Others, though, they tried. Bridges, once burned, were being carefully rebuilt. Lisa Hendricks was the first to cross. A simple plate of cookies, a hesitant smile. A quiet offering of something that wasn't just an apology, but an acknowledgement. Jaxon took the plate, meeting her gaze. "Thanks." Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. And as for Eleanor, well, some lessons are learned the hard way.